My name is Alara Whitford, and I turned 28 last spring. People often describe me as steady, the sort of woman who listens more than she speaks, who notices details others overlook. Tonight, that steadiness felt like a weight. We were gathered in my parents' restored townhouse in Savannah, its high ceilings and polished wood floors glowing under the chandelier. The table stretched long, covered in linen and silver that gleamed as though it had been set for royalty. Laughter traveled around the room, glasses clinking, forks scraping plates of roast chicken and candied yams. I sat midway down the table between my aunt and a cousin I barely knew. The conversation flowed around me without touching, a current I had no part in. Then my father rose to his feet, his glass lifted high, his eyes shone, already fixed on my sister at the far end of the table. "To the daughter who made us so proud," he boomed, the words filling every corner of the room. The applause was instant. My mother dabbed her eyes. An uncle whistled, and my sister blushed as though she had been crowned for a moment. The clapping covered everything, the scrape of chairs, the shuffle of feet. But when it quieted, I felt his gaze slide across the table until it landed on me. His smile held sharp at the edges, rehearsed. "And you," he added, pausing long enough for silence to gather, "when will we say that about you?" The laughter collapsed. Forks froze midair. My chest tightened, though I leaned back in my chair, forcing a calm smile. Their faces waited for me to play my role again, the quiet shadow, but memory stirred. The crown she wore had always been mine to chase. I grew up in a house where pride had a face, and it wasn't mine. The mantel above the fireplace was crowded with shining trophies, each one carrying my sister's name in bold letters. Gold and silver cups lined up like soldiers, ribbons cascading in neat folds. Every photo on the wall showed her smiling beneath spotlights at recitals, graduations, pageants where she always stood front and center. I remember the first time I tried to add something of my own. I had just come home from a state debate competition, a ribbon clutched in my hand. My voice had been sharp, my arguments precise, the judges calling my performance outstanding. I placed that ribbon carefully on the mantel beside her trophies, hoping it might belong there, too. The next morning, it was gone. I found it tucked into a drawer in my bedroom, never mentioned, never framed. Dad hadn't been in the audience that day. He was at my sister's dress rehearsal instead. Her wedding years later was spoken of like a royal coronation. The church was filled to the rafters, the aisle draped in white roses. My mother cried as though history itself were unfolding before her eyes. Photographers lingered for hours, capturing every laugh, every tilt of her veil. The pictures still hang in the hallway, commanding attention from anyone who enters the house. Meanwhile, my milestones passed quietly. A scholarship letter opened at the kitchen table. A job offer signed with trembling excitement, moments that dissolved into the background of her celebrations. It wasn't that I failed. I simply didn't sparkle the way she did. Even now, sitting at that dinner table with my father's question hanging in the air, the weight of those years pressed against my ribs. It was as if every clap, every toast, every framed photograph had built a crown so heavy it left no room for me beneath it. The crown my sister wore glittered in every corner of our home. But the weight I carried never shone. It lived in the quiet hours no one noticed, tucked into moments I never spoke of. When my mother's health began to slip in my early 20s, I was the one who drove her to late-night checkups. She never wanted anyone to know, insisting her fainting spells were just stress. So I kept the secret, waiting in sterile rooms while fluorescent lights hummed overhead. I held her coat, fetched her water, drove her home in silence. By the next morning, she was back to hosting brunches, smiling as if nothing had ever happened. The others saw her glow, not the tremor in her hands or the daughter who studied her. When my father's business faltered, it wasn't my sister who noticed the unopened envelopes piling on his desk. I slipped money into his account more than once, just enough to cover the gaps. He never asked, and I never told him, but I saw the relief in his face when the bills stopped stacking. At family dinners, he still raised his glass to my sister's promotions, never pausing to wonder how mine kept him afloat. At work, I earned my own titles, promotions fought for with late nights and endless weekends. Colleagues congratulated me. Supervisors recognized my persistence. Yet at home, no one asked about my job. No champagne waited. My victories lived in the shadows, swallowed by the glow of hers. I told myself it didn't matter. That strength wasn't supposed to be celebrated, just carried. But the truth pressed heavier each year. My sacrifices left no photographs on the walls, no stories retold at gatherings. They weren't trophies. They were invisible weights I balanced in silence. Sitting at that long table, my father's question echoing inside me, I thought of all the moments I had poured myself out without recognition. They had mistaken my steadiness for detachment, my quiet for emptiness. What they never understood was that their pride in her had been built on the scaffolding of my silence. The words hung above the table, heavier than the chandelier's glow. "When will we say that about you?" My father's tone had not carried curiosity, nor even hope. It had been a sentence wrapped in a smile, a verdict handed down as if my life had already been measured, weighed, and found lacking. No one spoke. The clatter of silverware had stilled. My aunt reached for her glass too quickly, the ring on her finger catching the candlelight like a flare, a signal to look away. My cousin coughed into his napkin, shifting uncomfortably in his chair. Across from me, my mother busied herself with arranging her fork just so against the plate, as though precision could disguise avoidance. My sister sat at the far end, the crown of attention still glowing faintly around her, though she couldn't bring herself to meet my eyes. She stared at the bread basket, lashes lowered, pretending fascination with crumbs. I recognized that expression. It was the same one she wore as a child when she'd win another ribbon and I'd stand to the side, waiting for my turn that never came. She wasn't proud of me then. She wasn't guilty either, just complicit in the silence. It struck me then how many times this ritual had played out. A dinner table, a room full of witnesses, a glass lifted in pride for her and me, the convenient shadow swallowing the sting so the night could carry on unbroken. I had learned long ago that silence was survival, the only way to keep peace. But as I sat there, their faces waiting for me to play that role once more, I realized survival had carved me out of my own family story. The air thickened, pressing against my skin. My father's smile lingered, rehearsed, daring me to either bow beneath it or break it. I could feel the weight of decades collecting inside me, a tide rising higher with every heartbeat. For the first time, the thought flickered sharp and undeniable. If silence had kept me alive, it had also erased me. And maybe tonight I was done disappearing. The glass in my hand felt cold, slick with condensation, the stem pressing a faint mark into my fingers. I had spent years gripping it politely, raising it when expected, smiling on cue. But that night, I let my hand drift downward. The sound it made when it touched the wood was soft, barely more than a click. Yet it rang out louder than any toast. I straightened in my chair, my voice steady, quiet enough that they had to lean into it. "Maybe when you stop comparing me to her," I said, for a breathless moment. The table froze. Even the candle flames seemed to pause, flickering without movement. My father's grin faltered, his jaw working as though he had misheard. My mother's fork slipped against her plate, the scrape sharp in the silence. My aunt blinked quickly, darting her eyes between us as if she had stumbled into the wrong room. At the far end, my sister's cheeks flushed, but not with pride this time. She shifted in her seat, fingers worrying the stem of her wine glass, eyes fixed downward, her composure cracked, the practiced poise slipping at the edges. It was the first break in the script we had all memorized. He would praise her. The family would laugh. I would stay quiet. Tonight, I had missed my cue, and the play had come to a halt. My father leaned forward, his voice lower now, tinged with warning. "That's not fair, Era." "Neither is spending my life as her comparison," I replied, calm as stone. The words surprised even me in their steadiness. I had imagined shouting or tears or shaking hands. Instead, my body held firm, every syllable placed with precision. My mother's eyes flicked toward me, wide with something between fear and recognition. She opened her mouth, then closed it, the napkin twisting in her lap. Around us, the guests shrank into silence, unwilling to move, as though any sound might shatter the fragile balance teetering between us. The chandelier hummed faintly above, its light casting sharp shadows across the tablecloth. I felt them all staring, waiting for me to back down, to soften, to let the moment pass. But I didn't. For the first time in years, I had spoken without apology. And the silence that followed no longer felt like punishment. It felt like power, raw and untested, pressing at the edges of a life I had almost forgotten could belong to me. The silence stretched, a taut thread that no one dared cut. My father's hand hovered above his glass as if he might lift it again, but the words had already slipped out of my mouth and settled into the room like ash. His certainty faltered. The smile that had once commanded the table looked brittle now, too thin to hide the crack beneath it. My mother's fingers twisted the napkin in her lap until it wrinkled into a tight knot. Her eyes stayed fixed on her plate, but I saw the quick flicker of her lashes, the way her throat worked as though she had swallowed something sharp. She wanted this to pass, to smooth over as it always had, only this time it didn't. At the end of the table, my sister sat motionless. Her face, usually serene under praise, carried a shadow of something else, guilt, or perhaps the sudden recognition of her part in the story. She lowered her eyes to her wine glass, tracing the rim with her fingertip, her composure slipping in tiny fractures. The crown she wore so effortlessly seemed to tilt, no longer steady. In that silence, memories surged back with painful clarity. I remembered the whispered jokes at a birthday party years ago when she leaned toward her friends and said, "She's not the family type," their laughter scattering like glass beads across the floor. I remembered the night of my scholarship award when I had burst through the door clutching the letter, only to find the living room crowded with relatives celebrating her recital instead. No one looked up when I spoke. Each memory was a piece of evidence, scattered but undeniable proof that the imbalance hadn't been imagined. It had been lived day after day until it shaped the way I carried myself at every table. Now, as I watched my sister's lashes tremble and my father's authority falter, I saw the truth for the first time. Their script was not unbreakable. The crown that had been polished and paraded for years was not indestructible. It wobbled, fragile under the weight of everything unsaid, and I realized with a clarity that felt like breath in my lungs, I had been holding up more of it than I ever knew. The knot in my chest loosened as the words formed, solid and sharp. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. Every time you praised her, I said, my hands resting still on the table, you erased me. The sound seemed to ripple outward, knocking against the walls, stealing the breath from the room. My father's jaw tightened, a muscle flickering beneath the skin as though he could grind my words into dust. His hand stayed clenched around the stem of his glass, unmoving, a man desperate to hold his script together. My mother's eyes filled instantly, tears gathering faster than she could hide. She lifted her napkin as though to shield her face, but the fabric only trembled in her fingers. She had always been the one to patch over tension, to shush conflict with polite smiles and quick distractions. Now her silence betrayed her, the tears refusing to obey her command. Across from me, my sister flinched as though struck, her lashes lowered, but not fast enough to mask the glimmer of shame. For years she had worn her crown so easily, shining beneath their applause. But now, with my words laid bare, the crown looked heavy in her hands, her shoulders curled inward, her fingers drumming nervously against the table. For the first time, I saw the cracks in her confidence. I didn't stop. The tide had risen too high. Do you know what it feels like? I continued to bring home victories and watch them vanish in the shadow of hers, to be there in every silence, in every gap you ignored, and never once be enough to earn your pride. The chandelier hummed above, filling the pause. My father stared at me, lips pressed into a hard line, but his silence was louder than any defense. He had lost the room, and he knew it. My mother's tears slipped free, trailing down her cheek. My sister's shoulders sank lower, the guilt she once buried rising like smoke. I had named the wound, and there was no taking it back. The air was thick with it, the truth uncoiling across the table, impossible to silence again. The words burned against my tongue, heavy with every year I had swallowed them back. But this time, I didn't let them dissolve. I leaned forward, steady and unshaken. "You ask when you'll be proud of me," I said, each syllable deliberate, sharp enough to cut through the air. "The real question is, when will you stop being ashamed of who I am?" The silence that followed was immediate, a vacuum that swallowed the room whole. The chandelier above seemed to hum louder, its crystal drops vibrating as if they, too, had heard the verdict. No one moved. My father's face drained of its practiced warmth, leaving only the hard lines of a man unprepared for defiance. His mouth opened slightly, then shut again, as if no answer could match the weight of the question. My mother's napkin slipped from her hands and fell into her lap. Her eyes glistened, lips trembling. But she said nothing. For years, she had been the keeper of peace, the one who smoothed over the sharp edges of my father's pride. But there was no smoothing this. Across the table, my sister's hand stilled on her glass, her shoulders hunched forward, her poise unraveling thread by thread. She wouldn't meet my eyes, not now, not with shame clouding her face. I sat in the silence, letting it stretch until it belonged to me. For once, it wasn't the silence of erasure. It was the silence of impact, of a truth too heavy to ignore. Every beat of my heart steadied me further, rooting me deeper in the chair that had never felt mine until tonight. The balance had shifted. The script was broken. And for the first time, the story no longer revolved around their pride. It revolved around my voice. The room remained frozen, their faces stiff with disbelief. When I reached for my napkin, I folded it carefully, smoothing each corner as though the moment deserved precision. Then I pushed back my chair. The sound of wood scraping against tile seemed louder than any toast that had ever filled this room. No one spoke as I rose. My mother's lips parted, but no words came. My sister's hands clutched her glass, the stem trembling between her fingers. My father stayed rigid, his jaw tight, eyes narrowed, as though silence might somehow return his authority. The chandelier glowed above us, throwing shards of light across their stillness, but it was no longer my cage. I walked from the table without waiting for permission, each step echoing louder than applause ever had. Behind me, I could feel their gazes clinging, desperate to pull me back into the script I had abandoned, but I didn't turn. That night, my phone buzzed endlessly in the family group chat. The whispers had already begun. Thinly veiled scolds dressed up as concern. "You embarrassed your father. You ruined dinner." A cousin sent a private text, "Are you okay?" The question carried more curiosity than care. Later, a message from my father arrived, clipped and cold. He hinted at the money I had quietly given years before, twisting it now into a weapon. "Be careful what bridges you burn. You may need them." I read it once, then set the phone aside. For the first time in years, I didn't feel the panic of pleasing them, of patching the wound they created. I felt a strange, steady calm, like breathing after being held underwater too long. Walking away had cost me their approval, perhaps even their support. But as the night stretched quiet around me, I realized it had given me something I had never felt in their presence: freedom. Weeks slipped by, the sharp edges of that night softening, but never disappearing. Savannah's evening air wrapped warm around me as I sat on a small balcony overlooking the quiet street. The live oaks swayed gently, their branches heavy with moss, the kind that always seemed to whisper history into the night. Beside me sat Claire, a friend who had never measured me against anyone. She poured 2 glasses of wine, her laughter bubbling over something small and silly we had remembered from college. No one was judging. No one was keeping score. The sound felt lighter than any applause I had ever chased. I thought of the decision I had made only days before to enroll in a course in historic preservation at the university downtown. It wasn't the path my family had scripted, not the polished story they would parade for relatives. It was mine, rooted in my love for old buildings, for the layers of stories etched into brick and wood. For the first time, I had chosen without waiting for their permission. Claire raised her glass, the amber catching the glow of the porch light. I lifted mine to meet hers, the clink soft, private, carrying no expectation beyond the moment itself. I leaned back in my chair, the night sky stretching wide above us. The stars blinked faintly through the canopy, and for once, I felt no weight pressing me down. Pride didn't sit across the table anymore, deciding whether or not to offer me a sip. It lived here in my chest, steady and undeniable. I raised my glass again, this time not toward anyone else, but toward myself, toward the woman who had finally stopped waiting to be chosen and chose herself instead.